Hi, my name is Sandra Whitfield. There's one day I'll never forget. It was a cold afternoon at the city hospital. I can still remember the sharp smell of disinfectant in the air, the steady beeping of the monitors beside me, and the harsh white lights above my head. I was lying in bed, my body heavy as stone, my throat raw after a sudden stroke that almost took me away. Through the haze, I heard footsteps I thought I'd recognize anywhere. My family had come. For a brief moment, relief washed over me. Finally, they were here. But then, the words that reached my ears froze my blood. A man's voice, deep and decisive, said, "She's not one of us anymore. Let her go." My heart sank. I waited for someone to hold my hand, to whisper my name, to beg me to fight. But none of that came. Instead, I heard the sound of shoes on the floor, and then the click of the door closing. They walked out without a goodbye, without a single tear. That was the moment I realized sometimes the people you believe are family are the very ones who leave you behind when you need them most. I woke up fully a few mornings later. Outside the window, the trees were dusted with snow, pale winter sunlight slipping through the blinds. In the room, the only sounds were the machines, steady and mechanical. My arms trembled as I tried to lift them like they'd forgotten how to move. But when I looked to my side, I didn't see my husband. I didn't see my son. Instead, sitting quietly by my bed was Marjorie Lane, my closest friend from high school. We had once shared everything, skipping classes to eat ice cream, crying over broken hearts, laughing about silly dreams. But we hadn't seen each other much in nearly a decade. Marjorie leaned forward, her eyes worried but determined. "You're awake, Sandra. I'm here." I wanted to ask, "Where's my family?" But all that came out was a hoarse whisper. Marjorie understood. She pressed her lips together, shook her head, and squeezed my hand a little tighter. The days that followed were slow. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. Lucky. But what a bitter kind of luck. Lying in bed, realizing the people you thought would never leave had already chosen silence. They never came back. No calls, no flowers, no sign of concern. It was Marjorie who brought me clean pajamas, who read the newspaper to me in the mornings, who encouraged me to take those shaky first steps in the hospital corridor. One afternoon, when I was strong enough to sit upright, she reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small wooden box. "I found this while sorting through your old apartment," she said softly. The box was worn, scratched at the edges. I hadn't seen it in years. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were old papers, a few photographs, and a single yellowed envelope with handwriting across the front. "For Sandra. Open when you're grown." My heart pounded. I had never seen this before. With trembling fingers, I tore open the brittle seal. Inside was a birth certificate, and the first line nearly stopped my breath. The name written there was not Sandra Whitfield. It read, Elena Sanders, parents Thomas and Evelyn Sanders. I blinked, reread, blinked again. My whole body went cold. All my life, I believed I was the only daughter of the Whitfield family. So why was there another name? I pulled out the next paper, a typed letter, signed by a woman named Margaret Sanders, grandmother. It began, "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, it means you are old enough to understand. You are a Sanders, not a Whitfield. When you were 6, we were forced to let you go. Circumstances left us no choice. But I never stopped loving you. You were never abandoned. You were hidden. And when you are grown, you have the right to know who you truly are." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Questions crowded my mind. Why didn't they tell me? Who really were the Sanders? And why did the Whitfields stay silent all these years? I looked at Marjorie, my voice cracking. They knew. They must have known. I was never really theirs. She placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Sandra, sometimes silence is a choice, and that choice can cut deeper than any lie." That night, sleep didn't come. The hum of the machines sounded like drums in my ears, heavy and relentless. Memories began rushing back things I had ignored or explained away. Why were my birthdays always a simple dinner while my cousins were grand parties? Why was I told to stay home during family trips because I had too much homework? Why was affection always measured, rationed, conditional? The truth had been there all along. I had just refused to see it. The next morning, I gathered enough courage to ask my doctor, "Doctor, when I was admitted, who signed the papers?" He hesitated, then sighed. "No one from your family. A friend, Miss Lane, I believe, provided contact information. Your family declined to sign." My chest tightened. It wasn't just words they left me with. They had legally erased themselves from my care. I turned to the wooden box on my bedside table. The papers, the photographs, the letter. They weren't just scraps of the past. They were keys to doors I had never dared to open. And I knew then. This was only the beginning. The wooden box never left my side. It sat on the table beside my bed like a witness, heavy with secrets. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that name written on the birth certificate, Elena Sanders, my name before it was changed. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. If this was true, who had I been living with all these years? And why had they hidden it from me? The morning after I discovered it, Marjorie brought coffee into the hospital room. She studied me with quiet concern and said, "You didn't sleep." I shook my head. How could I? That one letter had torn my entire life apart. But when I told her, she placed a hand on mine and said something that settled deep in my chest. "You don't have to face this alone. If you want answers, I'll help you find them." And I believed her. After all, she was here when no one else was. 2 weeks later, I was released. Marjorie drove me home in silence, as though she knew I needed the quiet to process everything. The world outside looked the same, but I didn't. I walked slowly, carefully, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. That night, we opened the box again, spreading the papers across my dining table. At the bottom was an envelope I hadn't noticed before, sealed tightly with brittle tape. On the front, confidential adoption records. My breath caught. I opened it with trembling fingers and read the words that confirmed my deepest fear. Adoption finalized August 12th, 1981. Child, Elena Margaret Sanders. Adoptive parents, Richard and Helen Whitfield. It was real. The Whitfields had adopted me when I was 6 years old, and at the bottom, in tiny type, was a clause. Contact with biological family to be maintained upon child's request. They had promised. They had signed. And then they had broken that promise, burying the truth for decades. Memories began to replay with new meaning. When I was 8, I once asked my mother why I didn't look like anyone else. She smiled tightly and told me not everyone had to look alike to belong. On my 12th birthday, when I asked for a baby photo album, she gave me a sweater instead. And at 15, during a fight about curfew, my father snapped, "You should be grateful we even took you in." At the time, I thought it was just anger. Now I knew better. 2 nights later, Marjorie returned with something else. She'd gone back to an old apartment I once rented, and in the back of a drawer, she found a bundle of envelopes. Each one was addressed to me, but the return address made my heart pound. Margaret Sanders Street, Louis, Missouri. My grandmother. Every envelope bore a red stamp. Undeliverable. Recipient moved. No forwarding address. I tore one open. Inside was a handwritten letter. "My sweet Elena, I hope this reaches you. I sent a card for your birthday, but it came back again. Please remember, no matter what they tell you, you are loved. You are ours. Grandma Maggie." The words blurred through my tears. She had written to me. She had searched for me. For years. And the Whitfields had intercepted every letter. sealing me off from the one person who never gave up. Marjorie's voice was hushed but fierce. They didn't just lie, Sandra. They made sure no one else could tell you the truth. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was in my hands, written in fading ink. I realized then this wasn't just about family secrets. It was about theft. Theft of time, of love, of connection. Marjorie insisted we see a lawyer. She introduced me to Carla Jennings, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a calm voice. Carla read through the papers without interruption. When she finished, she said, "Legally, you are Elena Sanders. The adoption is valid, but so is this clause. They agreed you would be told, and they broke that agreement. These letters prove deliberate concealment, and if there was money involved, this is even more serious." My head snapped up. Money? Carla tapped the adoption file. This isn't just about guardianship. Your grandmother left assets in trust, property, savings, investments. The estate should have been released to you once you turned 18. Instead, they concealed it. By today's estimates, it's worth several $1,000,000. I couldn't speak. My grandmother had left me a future, a lifeline, and they had locked it away, living their lives as if I never existed. It wasn't only emotional betrayal, it was deliberate erasure, designed to benefit themselves. Word must have spread because a few days later my adoptive brother Daniel came to my door. His face was pale, his posture restless. He said, "Sandra, Elena, whatever. You don't have to do this. Mom's upset, Dad's furious, you're tearing us apart." I stared at him. Family doesn't stand in a hospital room and say, "Let her go." That isn't family. He shifted uncomfortably, then whispered, "You were never supposed to find out." Those words hit like a hammer. Never supposed to find out. They had built their entire lives on the expectation that I would stay silent, obedient, erased. From that moment, my path was clear. With Marjorie's help, I gathered every scrap of evidence. Hospital documents where my name was missing, scans of the intercepted letters, even messages from relatives hinting that I wasn't truly one of them. We labeled folders: adoption suppression, letters, financial misuse. Piece by piece, the story formed into something undeniable. One evening, I opened my laptop and typed a short post. Sometimes family is the silence that erases you. But one day, silence becomes your weapon, and the truth speaks louder than blood. I hit send without thinking. Hours later, my inbox overflowed, messages from strangers. This happened to my cousin. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for saying what we couldn't. For the first time, I felt less alone. That post caught the attention of a local journalist named Laura Singh. She wrote, "Hi Sandra, I covered your stroke for the Gazette. I believe your story runs deeper. Would you consider talking, even off the record?" I hesitated. Going public terrified me, but Marjorie reminded me, "They've spent your whole life trying to bury you. Maybe it's time the world knew you were here all along." That night, I sat by the window with the wooden box in my lap. Snow drifted under the streetlight, soft and steady. I thought of the hospital, of the words I heard when I couldn't speak. "She's not one of us. Let her go." But I hadn't gone. I was still here, holding proof of who I was. For years, silence had been forced on me. But now, silence belonged to me. I whispered into the quiet, almost like a vow. My name is Elena Sanders, and the truth is coming out. When I whispered those words, "My name is Elena Sanders," something inside me shifted. It was as if I had drawn a line in the sand. For years, the Whitfields had controlled the narrative, painting me as theirs when it suited them and erasing me when it didn't. But the truth was no longer a fragile secret tucked away in an old wooden box. It was alive, undeniable, and about to be spoken out loud. Carla, the attorney, wasted no time. She gathered the adoption papers, the intercepted letters, the hospital records. She showed me how each piece of evidence told the same story: deliberate suppression. She explained that the court could freeze assets if there was suspicion of fraud, and that the Whitfields' actions could fall under that category. I listened carefully, nodding, but in truth, my mind was somewhere else. I kept replaying Daniel's words at my front door. "You were never supposed to find out." The audacity of it still stunned me. They thought they could build their entire lives on a lie and I would never open the door. They thought wrong. Within 2 weeks, Carla filed a petition. A hearing date was set. I was officially listed under my birth name, Elena Margaret Sanders. For the first time in decades, I was legally myself. The news hit the Whitfields like a storm. I knew because my phone began buzzing non-stop. Calls from my adoptive mother, messages from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, pleas, threats, excuses. I ignored them all. If they had nothing to say when I was lying in a hospital bed, they had nothing worth hearing now. One message stood out, though. It was from my adoptive mother. "You don't understand the damage you're causing. We did what we thought was best. Don't ruin everything." I stared at the words. Best for whom? Best for them, certainly, never for me. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. Marjorie insisted on driving me. As we pulled into the courthouse parking lot, I noticed the small crowd of people outside. Some were reporters with cameras, others were strangers holding handwritten signs. One read, "Justice for Elena." Another, "Silence is complicity." I wasn't expecting that. My story had touched something beyond me, beyond the Whitfields. It had struck a chord with anyone who had ever been erased, silenced, or told they didn't belong. Inside, the air was brisk with the scent of old paper and disinfectant. We passed through security and rode the elevator up to a long hallway. A clerk guided us into a conference-style room where a court reporter was already setting up. I sat at the long table, my hands folded tightly together, while Marjorie sat just behind me for support. Carla organized our documents into neat stacks, calm and deliberate. Across the table, the door opened, and in walked the Whitfields. Daniel entered first, jaw clenched, eyes bloodshot. Behind him came my adoptive mother, Helen, wearing oversized sunglasses even though the room was dim. She carried herself like a woman preparing for battle, her lips pursed, her posture stiff. My adoptive father, Richard, was nowhere to be seen. Carla leaned toward me and whispered, "He left the state 2 days ago." Coward, I thought. The session began with formalities. The court reporter noted the date, time, parties present, and the purpose: to review the petition of Elena Sanders regarding inheritance suppression and family fraud. Then she did something that made the air grow still. She read aloud from the hospital memo. "Patient in ICU, family identified as mother, father, son. At 11:04 p.m., mother stated, 'She's not our daughter. Let her go.' Family exited without signing documentation." Every word was like a hammer striking the table. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, the presiding officer, Judge Karen Doyle, turned to Helen. Her voice was firm, not unkind, but unflinching. "Did you say this?" Helen lowered her head slightly, mumbling, "It was a misunderstanding." Carla slid a folder across the table. "Your Honor, we have evidence that following that statement, the family attempted to access trust funds not legally theirs. Here are copies of forged mail interception requests and bank communications suggesting they declared my client incompetent to justify early withdrawal." Judge Doyle flipped through the documents, her expression unreadable. "Proceed." As Carla spoke, laying out point after point, I sat perfectly still. For years, it had been my word against theirs. Now it was ink, stamps, signatures. Proof that didn't shake or stammer. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, finally breaking the silence. "We didn't know how to handle it. She was gone. Mom was breaking down." His voice cracked, but I raised a hand, stopping him. "You weren't scared for me," I said calmly. "You were scared of being exposed? That's not the same as love." He looked down at the table. For once, he had nothing to say. Carla opened another folder, placing down a notarized clause from my grandmother's will. The words were simple but powerful. In the event that Elena Sanders is located and identified as alive, all inheritance processes are to freeze until her personal approval is filed in court. The room went silent again. This wasn't just a family squabble. This was a legal fact they could not erase. Judge Doyle glanced between us, then nodded to her clerk. Open a full investigation into the management of the Sanders Trust and any withdrawals over the past 15 years. And just like that, it was official. My truth had weight. My existence had been recognized. The Whitfields couldn't bury me anymore. When the session ended, Helen stormed out first, sunglasses still on. Daniel lingered for a moment, then muttered something under his breath before following. Reporters were waiting in the hallway, cameras flashing, questions flying. Elena, do you feel vindicated? What message do you want others in your position to hear? Do you plan to press charges? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Carla placed a steady hand on my shoulder, and together we walked past the cameras into the winter sunlight. Outside, the cold air filled my lungs. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Not joy, not revenge peace. The kind that comes when you've finally been heard. The days that followed were a blur. Calls kept coming, but I blocked every number. Online, my story spread quickly. People debated, sympathized, criticized. Some called the Whitfields monsters. Others said families were complicated, that no one could understand from the outside. I didn't read too much. I didn't need their judgment. I had the truth. Then 1 week later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was tucked between a utility bill and a grocery flyer, plain white envelope, neat, slightly shaky handwriting across the front. Rebecca Margaret Sanders. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single page. Dear Elena, I saw the news. I saw you standing there in court, and I knew there she is. We never stopped looking for you. When Grandma passed, it felt like the thread had snapped, but I kept a photo, just in case. If this reaches you, I would love to talk. No pressure, no reporters, just truth. With love, your Aunt Meredith. Folded inside the letter was an old photograph. A baby swaddled in a blanket, nestled in the arms of a woman in nurse's scrubs. My grandmother, my real grandmother, the one who had never stopped searching. I stared at the picture for a long time, my throat tightening. Then I pulled out a piece of stationery and began to write. Dear Aunt Meredith, thank you. Yes, I would like to know more. Yes, I remember her, even now. Sincerely, Elena. The following weekend, we met in a quiet cafe off a country road. No cameras, no reporters, just two women and a pot of coffee. Meredith looked like someone who carried her years with purpose. Her hair silver, her eyes sharp but warm. When she saw me, she stood and hugged me. Not too tight, not too stiff. Just right. You look just like her, she whispered. We sat for hours. She told me about my mother, Celia, how she had died giving birth to me at only 22. How my grandmother had fought to keep me, but legal complications and a father who refused responsibility had forced me into the system. It was supposed to be temporary, Meredith said, her eyes glistening. But then you were gone. Records sealed. We tried everything. She handed me a folder filled with photos, letters, hospital papers, and inside, a simple bracelet made of pink thread with faded words, Baby Girl Sanders. I held it carefully, as though it might dissolve in my hands. So all this time, my voice broke. You were never unwanted, Meredith said firmly. You were lost to us. Not by choice. Never by choice. I nodded slowly, tears slipping down my cheeks. For the first time in years, the silence inside me began to lift. The first hug from Aunt Meredith lingered with me long after we left the cafe. It wasn't just an embrace, it was a thread pulling me back to a history I'd been denied. For years, I had believed I was unloved, abandoned, disposable. But in that moment, sitting across from her, I understood something I had never dared to hope. I had always been wanted. I had always been part of something bigger, even if it had been stolen from me. Meredith didn't overwhelm me with too much all at once. She let the memories come slowly, pouring them like cups of coffee we could sip one at a time. She showed me a photo of my mother, Celia, a young woman with soft brown hair, laughing eyes, and a smile that felt strangely familiar. My smile. "She adored you," Meredith whispered. "She sang to you every night, even when she was exhausted. You were her joy." Hearing those words was like water after a long drought. For decades I had been fed silence, indifference, and conditional affection. To learn that my mother had loved me so deeply in the brief time she had, it stitched a piece of me back together. Meredith told me stories about my grandmother, Maggie, how she fought with lawyers, wrote dozens of letters, even traveled across states trying to challenge the adoption records. She used to say, Meredith recalled with tears in her eyes, "One day, Elena will come back to us. I have to keep the light on for her." I held the bracelet Maggie had made the pink thread, frayed but strong. I whispered into it like a prayer. "I came back, Grandma. I'm here." Rebuilding myself wasn't a neat or quick process. Some days I woke with purpose, ready to dive into this new chapter. Other days, the weight of betrayal sat heavy on my chest, and I couldn't get out of bed. Marjorie stayed close, reminding me that healing wasn't a straight line. She made sure I ate, she brought over books, she even dragged me out to the park when I tried to lock myself inside. The legal battle with the Whitfields dragged on in the background. Carla kept me updated, her voice steady and reassuring. The court had frozen the assets, and the investigation into fraudulent withdrawals was underway. I didn't need revenge, I only wanted truth. But truth had a way of demanding accountability, and slowly, piece by piece, the Whitfields' facade crumbled. Richard, my adoptive father, was subpoenaed. He avoided court for months until finally appearing, looking smaller, older, diminished. Helen maintained her icy distance, insisting she had acted out of protection. "We didn't want to confuse her," she told the judge, as if stripping me of identity was an act of kindness. The words no longer pierced me. They bounced off a shield made of letters, photos, and love that I now knew had always existed. The press eventually moved on to other stories, but occasionally people would still recognize me. Once, at a grocery store, a woman in her 60s approached. "You're the one from the paper, right? The one who found her family?" I hesitated, unsure how much to admit, but she smiled warmly. "My sister gave up a baby years ago. We never found her. Seeing you, it gives me hope." Her words stayed with me. Maybe my story wasn't just mine. Maybe it belonged to every person who had ever been erased or silenced. Reconnecting with the Sanders family unfolded slowly, like turning pages of an old book. Meredith introduced me to cousins I'd never met. They welcomed me cautiously at first, unsure how much of me was still theirs. But when they heard my voice, saw the photographs, when I wore the bracelet on my wrist, something shifted. They began to share their own stories. Birthdays I had missed, reunions with an empty chair, jokes about how I would have loved the family dog. One evening, Meredith invited me to her house for dinner. It was nothing fancy, just roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and pie. But as we sat around the table, laughing over spilled gravy and teasing each other about who got the last slice of dessert, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. Not the kind of belonging that demands silence or obedience, but the kind that accepts you exactly as you are. After dinner, Meredith led me to the attic. She opened a cedar chest and pulled out a quilt. "Your grandmother made this," she said, unfolding it. Each square was stitched with care, patterned with scraps of fabric from dresses and curtains long gone. In the center square, embroidered in faded thread, were the words, for Elena. Come home safe. I pressed the quilt to my face, inhaling the faint scent of lavender that lingered even after all these years. I felt like a child again, wrapped in love that had traveled across time just to find me. Of course, the scars didn't vanish overnight. There were still nights when I dreamt of the hospital, of voices saying, "She's not ours. Let her go." I still woke sometimes with tears on my cheeks, haunted by the silence of the people who had raised me. But the difference was this. Now I had voices to counter those memories. Voices telling me I had been loved, I had been wanted, and I had always belonged to a family who never stopped waiting. Marjorie encouraged me to start journaling, and soon my notebook filled with memories, both old and new. I wrote about the smell of coffee at Meredith's kitchen table, about the sound of laughter echoing through a house that once felt empty. I wrote about Grandma Maggie's letters, and how each word felt like a lifeline tossed across decades. The responses poured in. Dozens, then hundreds of people shared their own stories of adoption, of loss, of hidden truths. Some were still searching, some had given up. But together, in that digital space, we became a kind of family too. Proof that silence could be broken and that even strangers could hold each other up. Months passed. The court finally ruled in my favor. The Sanders estate, long withheld, was restored to me. But the money mattered less than the principle. My identity had been recognized. My voice had been heard. The Whitfields retreated into silence, their power over me broken forever. On the anniversary of my mother's death, Meredith and I visited her grave. It was a small stone in a quiet cemetery, etched with her name, Celia Sanders, 1960 to 1981. I knelt down, tracing the letters with my fingertips. "Hi, Mom," I whispered. It's me, you're Elena. I'm sorry it took so long, but I'm here now." Meredith placed flowers by the stone. We stood there in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of love, of memory, of presence. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Rebuilding wasn't about erasing the past. It was about stitching it together with the present, creating a fabric strong enough to hold both. I still bore the name Sandra, but I carried Elena too. 2 names, 2 lives, finally united in one truth. I began volunteering with an organization that helped adoptees search for their biological families. I listened to stories that mirrored mine, letters hidden, names changed, voices silenced, and each time I told my own story, I saw hope flicker in someone else's eyes. That became my healing, turning my pain into a lantern for others still walking in the dark. One evening, as I sat on my porch, wrapped in my grandmother's quilt, Marjorie joined me. We watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and purple. She leaned over and said, "You know, Sandra, or Elena, whatever you want to call yourself, you made it." I smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep within. I didn't make it alone. And that was the truth. Healing wasn't something I had done by myself. It was built with the hands of a grandmother who never stopped writing, an aunt who never stopped searching, a friend who never stopped showing up. The past had stolen much from me. But the future was mine. The seasons changed quickly that year. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came a new rhythm to my life. My days were no longer consumed by legal documents, old secrets, or painful confrontations. Instead, they were filled with gentler things. The smell of blooming lilacs outside my window, the laughter of cousins rediscovered, the quiet reassurance of letters from people across the country who said my story gave them courage. I often thought about the phrase Meredith had shared with me at our very first meeting. "Your grandmother always said, 'One day Elena will come back to us. I have to keep the light on for her.'" That phrase stayed with me. It became the thread weaving all the broken pieces together. For decades, I had lived in darkness, confused, silenced, treated like an outsider in my own home. Yet somewhere, unseen, there had been a light left burning for me. A grandmother writing letters, an aunt searching, a family waiting with arms open. And in the end, I had found my way back to it. Life after the court ruling settled into something steady, though not always simple. The Whitfields no longer reached out. Sometimes I wondered if I would ever see them again, if they carried regret or shame. Other times, I wondered if it even mattered. Their silence was no longer my prison. It was simply absence. An absence, I realized, can no longer hurt you once you've filled it with presence. The Sanders family gave me plenty of that. Meredith called almost every evening just to check in. My cousins invited me to birthdays, picnics, even little league games. At first, I felt like a guest at the table. Hesitant, careful, afraid of intruding on bonds that had existed long before I returned. But over time, something shifted. They stopped calling me Sandra and started calling me Elena. And each time I heard it, my heart recognized the sound as home. There was one moment I'll never forget. At a family gathering in July, my cousin's daughter tugged at my sleeve and asked, "Aunt Elena, will you braid my hair?" She said it so naturally, as if the word aunt had belonged to me all along. As I brushed her hair and braided it into neat rows, I realized that family isn't just history or blood. Family is also the future, in the voices of children who accept you without hesitation. Still, healing was not just about gaining, it was also about letting go. I spent weeks sorting through old photographs from the Whitfield years. Some I kept, others I placed in a box for storage. I didn't want to erase those years entirely. After all, they had shaped me. But I no longer needed to cling to them as proof of belonging. One evening, I sat alone with a picture of myself at age 10, standing stiffly between Helen and Richard at a Christmas tree. My smile in the photo was polite, small, almost apologetic. I studied that little girl and whispered, "You deserved better." But you survived. Then I tucked the picture away, not in bitterness, but in peace. I began speaking at adoption support groups. The first time, my hands shook as I stood before a circle of strangers. But when I started to tell my story, how I discovered the letters, how I reclaimed my name, I saw nods, tears, and recognition. A man in his 60s came up afterward and said, "I've carried questions my whole life. Tonight, I feel less alone." That was when I knew sharing wasn't just healing for me. It was healing for others, too. Soon I was invited to conferences, community centers, even schools. Each time I told the truth simply. Silence can wound as deeply as lies. But truth, even when painful, is the first step toward healing. One day, I received an email from a young woman in Texas. She wrote, "I watched your story online. Because of you, I searched for my biological family and found my sister. We cried for hours. Thank you for showing me it was possible." I sat at my desk reading her words over and over, feeling tears slip down my cheeks. To think that my pain could turn into someone else's hope, it was a kind of grace I never expected. Marjorie remained my anchor through it all. She teased me when I stumbled over speeches, cheered when I published my first article in a local magazine, and sat beside me on quiet evenings when memories grew heavy. One night, as we drank tea on the porch, she said, "You know, I think your grandmother would be proud, not just because you found your family, but because you're helping others find theirs too." I smiled. I think she'd probably scold me for waiting so long to read that letter. Marjorie laughed, her eyes soft. Maybe, but she'd also tell you the timing was exactly what it needed to be. Her words comforted me. Perhaps healing doesn't happen when we demand it. Perhaps it arrives when we're ready to receive it. There were still scars. Nights when I dreamed of the hospital room, when I heard again the words, "She's not one of us. Let her go." But even in those dreams, something had changed. In the corner of the room, I now imagined a different voice, strong and steady, whispering, "You are ours. You always were." And that voice carried me back to sleep. I often visited my mother's grave with Meredith. Sometimes we brought flowers. Sometimes we just sat in silence. I would tell her about my days, the speeches, the letters, the laughter of cousins. I told her about the quilt and how I wrapped myself in it on cold nights. I told her about the little girl who called me Aunt Elena. And each time, I ended with the same words. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm finally okay." As summer turned to autumn, I realized I had entered a new chapter. The story was no longer about betrayal or loss. It was about reclamation, about how truth, once hidden, had found its way into the light. I started writing a book, not just about my journey, but about the universal search for belonging. Each page felt like stitching another square into my grandmother's quilt. Not perfect, not without frayed edges, but strong enough to hold. And through it all, I carried one lesson above all. Family is not defined by silence, secrecy, or blood alone. Family is defined by love that refuses to be extinguished. The Whitfields had tried to silence me, but the Sanders had left a light on, and that light had guided me home. The last time I visited Grandma Maggie's grave, I brought a lantern. It was a simple one, glass and brass, with a small candle inside. I lit it and placed it beside her stone, the flame flickering in the evening wind. "Grandma," I whispered, "you kept the light on for me. Now I'll keep it burning for others, for anyone still searching, still waiting, still hoping." I stood there for a long time, watching the flame dance against the darkening sky. I knew then that my story wasn't ending. It was continuing, woven into the lives of others who would find their way because of it. And as I walked away, quilt draped over my shoulders, I carried with me not the weight of the past, but the light of a future built on truth. Because my name is Elena Sanders, and after all the silence, after all the loss, I am finally, irrevocably home. Autumn slipped quietly into winter again, marking nearly a full year since the night everything changed. A year since the stroke, the hospital room, the box of secrets. A year since my name shifted from Sandra Whitfield back to Elena Sanders. Sometimes it astonished me how much could change in 12 short months and how much of my life had been waiting all along for this very season. The house felt different now, not haunted, not heavy, but alive. Photographs of my biological family lined the shelves. My mother Celia with her bright smile, my grandmother Maggie with her kind eyes, Aunt Meredith in her youth, holding me as a baby. These pictures didn't erase the Whitfields from my past, but they finally anchored me to a truth I could trust. I had begun to think of my life in two halves, the first defined by silence, the second by voice. Silence had been forced on me, letters hidden, identity suppressed, belonging denied. But voice was what I chose now, and with that choice came a responsibility I hadn't expected, to speak for others who still lived in silence. The speaking invitations grew steadily. First, it was adoption support circles, then local libraries, then community halls filled with people who had stories that echoed mine. I learned to read the room the way someone's eyes filled with tears when I mentioned letters intercepted, or the way another nodded fiercely when I spoke about silence being as cruel as lies. Each time I reminded them, the truth may be hidden, but it is never lost. It waits for you. At one conference, a woman my age approached me afterward, trembling. She whispered, "I was adopted too." My parents never told me until last year. I thought I was crazy for feeling out of place all those years. Hearing you, it feels like my heart finally has language. I hugged her tightly. In that moment, I understood that sharing wasn't just healing for me, it was legacy. Every story I told planted a seed of courage in someone else. And perhaps one day, those seeds would grow into their own truths, revealed. The court case reached its conclusion that winter. The Whitfields were found guilty of concealing inheritance and violating adoption agreements. Some assets were ordered restored, others long gone. But the verdict wasn't about money anymore. It was about recognition. It was about standing in a courtroom where, for the first time in my life, my name, Elena Sanders, was spoken as if it had never been erased. I didn't attend the final ruling. Carla read it to me over the phone as I sat by the fire with the quilt around my shoulders. When she finished, I thanked her and then whispered into the quiet room, "Grandma, we did it." They can't silence us anymore. I never heard from the Whitfields again. Not a call, not a letter, not even a rumor. Their silence no longer frightened me. It simply confirmed what I had learned. Love built on lies cannot survive the truth, and I had chosen truth. The Sanders family became my anchor. Meredith, in particular, refused to let me retreat into solitude. "You lost too many years," she said firmly. "We're not losing anymore." She made sure I was at every birthday, every holiday, every Sunday dinner she could pull me to. It was overwhelming at first, the noise of children, the warmth of crowded tables, the chaos of too many voices speaking at once. But over time, I realized it was the very chaos I had been missing. Family isn't quiet perfection. It's messy, it's loud, it's sometimes frustrating, but it is real. And real is what I had been searching for all along. One night, as we cleaned dishes after a family gathering, Meredith turned to me and said, "You know, Elena, Mom would have been so proud of you. She wanted nothing more than for you to know where you belonged." Tears stung my eyes, but I smiled. I think I know now. In the spring, I began volunteering full-time with organizations dedicated to adoption transparency and family reunification. I met young people searching for birth parents, parents searching for children, grandparents holding on to hope. I helped them navigate records, write letters, push through bureaucracy. Every time someone was reunited, I felt as though my grandmother's light had stretched just a little farther into the world. The lantern I had placed at her grave became a symbol for me. I had it engraved with words, "Keep the light on." When I spoke publicly, I brought a smaller lantern with me, placing it on the podium as I told my story. It reminded me and everyone listening that truth is like a flame. It can flicker, it can be hidden, but it cannot be extinguished. Healing, I learned, isn't just for oneself. Healing becomes legacy when it reaches others. And slowly, my life began to feel less like a wound and more like a gift I could offer. One afternoon, a school invited me to speak to teenagers about identity and resilience. At first, I wondered if they would even care. Teenagers are often restless, distracted. But as I spoke, I saw their faces grow still. When I finished, one boy raised his hand and asked, "So, if your family lied, how did you not end up hating everyone?" I thought carefully before answering. Because hate is just another form of silence, and I've had enough silence for one lifetime. I chose truth, and truth is louder than hate. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't absence, but presence. And I knew they had understood. That summer, I returned to the cemetery with Meredith. This time, we didn't bring flowers. We brought the quilt. We spread it on the grass beside my mother's grave, and we sat together eating sandwiches and telling stories. For hours, we laughed, we cried, we remembered. It felt less like mourning and more like reunion. As the sun began to set, Meredith reached for my hand. "Do you realize," she said softly, "you've done more than survive? You've built a bridge back to us. And now, others are walking across that bridge too." I looked at her, then at the quilt, then at the headstone. I thought about all the letters Maggie had written, the way she refused to give up on me even when the world seemed determined to erase me. She had left the light on, and now it was my turn to do the same. I began planning a foundation in her name, the Maggie Sanders Light Project. Its mission was simple: to help families torn apart by adoption secrecy reconnect, to advocate for transparency in records, to remind the world that identity is not a privilege, it is a right. The paperwork was tedious, the fundraising slow, but the vision gave me purpose. And as word spread, support came from unexpected places: social workers, lawyers, even other families who had lived through similar pain. Together, we created something bigger than any one story, something that would keep the light burning for generations to come. Now, when I sit by the window in the evenings, I no longer think about the hospital room or the voices that abandoned me. I think about the voices that carried me forward. My mother's lullabies, my grandmother's letters, Meredith's laughter, Marjorie's steady encouragement, and the voices of strangers who tell me my story gave them courage. My name is Elena Sanders. That name was hidden, denied, silenced, but it survived. And because it survived, I can now pass it on not as a burden, but as a legacy. When I think of the future, I don't picture courtrooms or secrets. I picture lanterns glowing in windows, guiding lost children home. I picture quilts stitched together with love and memory. I picture a world where no one has to wonder if they belong, because the truth is always waiting to be found. And when I close my eyes at night, I whisper the same words I spoke when this journey began. I am here. I am loved. I am home. And so, after years of silence and secrets, I finally found the truth. I learned that family isn't only about blood or names. It's about love that refuses to give up. My journey was painful, but it gave me strength, and it showed me that healing is always possible. If you've ever felt lost, remember this: there may still be a light left on for you. Thank you for watching. If this story spoke to your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. And always remember, you matter, and your love leaves a mark.